Greetings, viewer. Previously, I spoke on the COVID pandemic and the new season. In this video, I will discuss which of the churches I chose between the charismatic one and the Calvinistic one, as well as general theological development. Before I get into that, it's worth stating that my grandfather would pass away around this time, and my father would follow months later. So keep in mind that I was basically operating with a moderate fulcrum of grief during the events discussed within this specific video. I would go with the Calvinistic Church for two reasons. The first one is that I actually had cousins who lived in Nashville once upon a time back in around the early mid 2010s, and they had attended this church, the semi Calvinistic one. So I did have a family connection there. The second reason is a bit of an interesting story and might potentially lead to this church being identified, but it's still an interesting story. So, somebody had thrown a flaming cocktail into this church and started a fire and burned up about a third of the building. And for some reason, I thought, go to that church that was attacked. This church, funny enough, would later respond by opening up a coffee shop in the very spot where the cocktail was thrown, and they actually called it Surefire Coffee. So I thought that was kind of cool, a way of taking lemons that life gives you and making lemonade out of it. Anyways, I felt a bit of spiritual and theological whiplash on account from going to a Pentecostal Foursquare church to going to a semi-Calvinistic SBC church that would have identified itself as Reformed or Reformed Baptist. I got involved with the music team because, of course, I did, and their hospitality team as well. While this church would still rightly be called evangelical and rightly also be called Baptist, it was more so in a theological sense and less so in a socio-cultural sense. This church was generally within the milieu of New Calvinism, what you saw generally in the mid 2010s going up to the early 2020s. Think of people like, Mark Driscoll, John Piper, Matt Chandler, R.C. Sproul, John MacArthur, people of that ilk. It was at this church that I would repent of Arianism and really begin my theological development. A side note on that, I'd become convinced of infant baptism during my mission 3 videos ago, but more Calvinistic Baptists are more amicable toward paedobaptism than General Baptists, most Charismatics, or most Evangelicals. But back to the main point, I would actually read the Bible with this church's Bible reading plan and did so in its entirety like 2 times. While the Bible translation that this church preferred was ESV, I had a personal preference for NRSV. So when the executive pastor was preaching and cross-referenced a verse in the NRSV, I immediately noticed that really quickly. Long story short, I reached out to him about it, and this led to a very wonderful conversation that had lasted like 2 or 3 hours. There was a fierce ecumenical disposition thanks to my 2018 mission in Madison that was highly welcomed by the executive pastor as well. One of the highlights of this original conversation was him affirming paedobaptism, funny enough, if you could believe it, me asking him how that interacts with his official position as, the executive pastor of what's a Baptist church, essentially. And he told me, Bill, I'm going to assume that you as a public school teacher understand the difference between something that you may personally think and something that you may have to proliferate on account of your position. From that point, I would ask him various questions, about the Christian faith, about the Bible, church history, patristics, stuff like that. This is really how my faith formation began. And, this is really how I was being shepherded during my earlier years in Nashville. A few months later, I would have a meeting with the lead pastor of the church, who is different, by the way, from the executive pastor, okay? The music director of the church just so happened to be in the building at the time. The very next week, I found myself in a restaurant with the music director and the lead pastor, sharing our life stories and a dozen or so burgers. I went into it originally, honestly, having a bunch of anxiety, given what had happened the last time I was at a table with the pastor and a music director. But I left without any anxiety. Both of these men brought me there just because they wanted to share a local treasure of Nashville with me. And this is one of the memories of this church that I'm very fond of, perhaps the one that I'm the most fond of. The only thing about this church that I just did not like was how far it was from where I lived. I would have loved nothing more than to basically have a slice of it in my own part of town. In this next video, however, I will talk about church planting. Peace.